inclusive and impactful adaptation movement. We're really excited for this webinar today. Before we get started, we will go through some housekeeping rules to ensure we have a successful webinar. We ask that everybody online to place your phone or computer on mute. This will help reduce any feedback. We will have plenty of time after presentations for question and answers. Throughout the webinar, we encourage you to use the questions function below to submit questions to the panel members. We will do the best to answer all of them. You can also raise your hand in the dashboard, and we will unmute you, and you can ask the question directly to the presenters if you wish to use that function. You can also use the chat function to report any technical issues or problems you might be encountering. We will try our best to resolve and to ensure that you have a favorable webinar experience. You can also use the chat function to communicate between attendees and between the panel members, or emphasize anything that you heard during the presentations. It's also a really good way to interact with the other participants. And finally, I wanted to let everybody know that we will be recording the webinar and posting it in the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange website for future viewing. Those should be able to be seen next week at cakex.org, and we'll be posting the direct link on the chat function as well. So without further ado, next slide, please. I just want to introduce Niall Malloy, which will be our moderator for the webinar today. Niall Malloy is a climate equity strategist and consultant who brings over 15 years of economic development, public health, community organizing, philanthropic relationship building, climate change, and environmental justice experience. He has participated as a program committee member for both the California and National Adaptation Forum. And he has also been helping on the National Adaptation Forum on Equity Working Group, which I'm really happy to have him as a friend there. He is a senior manager at the Neighborhood Funders Group, leading with Democratizing Development Program. Before joining the Neighborhood Funders Group, Niall worked for 8 years as the Northern California Program Director at the Communities for a Better Environment, managing campaigns and programs on climate adaptation, clean energy, environmental justice, and local economic development projects. Without further ado, Niall, take it away.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, everyone, for joining the call, rolling up our sleeves together, building an inclusive and impactful adaptation movement. And this conversation is in line with a lot of discussions we've been having over the year. The past year, gearing up to the third annual National Adaptation Forum, about a conversation about how do we better understand the current political moment, thinking through the current administration approaches that address climate change issues, and how do we build our muscle together around climate equity and solutions. So from decisions on Standing Rock to proposed changes at EPA, we know these conversations are shifting at a rate that many of us have just been more or less addressing, in small conversations. But I think in this forum space, we want to be able to figure out what role the forum can actually play in terms of really connecting the dots between the local, regional, national, state, and national level around these issues that are linked to climate equity, adaptation, and justice for communities. So as we prepare for this year's adaptation, some of the key questions for this call is about how do we build partnerships? How have we been building partnerships? What are those barriers in building those partnerships? And how do we begin to think about the climate work in a more inclusive way and address the silos that we see that are happening? And knowing that each part is very important, how do we further connect those dots? And so we have three presenters who are actually going to help us spark a conversation. And I'm going to introduce all three presenters, and then we're going to have them begin. The first presenter is going to be Andrea Ajar. She is the Executive Director of the Our Power Campaign and the Climate Justice Alliance. They're our national alliance that has been working on grassroots sector and provides agile leadership and structure to address and adapt to the changing and complex priorities of local communities while influencing national and international agendas. She has also served as a leading member of the local to international organization that include La Via Campesina in North America, U.S. Food Sovereignty Alliance, the Building Equity Alignment for Impact, and U.S. Friends of Movement of Dam-Affected Peoples, and many others. The second presenter will be Sandra Pope. She is the president and CEO, and she is a well-respected thought leader, innovative strategist, and trusted authority who have only worked on conceptual, unique methods of developing strategies that build bridges across issues, sectors, demographics, and communities. But she also has did a lot of work in facilitation and guidance on implementation of such methodologies. She has worked at the SEIU as a lead organizer and program manager, at the Sierra Club as a program manager, and also SAFE at the Director of Diversity and Community Partnerships. And she will tell you a little bit more about her work as a consultant leading some of these efforts. And the last presenter will be Ernesto Aravello, who works at the Communities for a Better Environment. And he leads the CARE project, which is the Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Enhancement program for CBE. And CBE is a California-based statewide nonprofit building community power to achieve environmental justice, clean energy, and healthy communities. While CBE recognized that their work in creating policies to reduce greenhouse gases and lessen our reliance on fossil fuels continues to be critical, they also realize it's inevitable that climate change will significantly impact the lives of their members. And so the three presenters will actually give a presentation, and we will actually think about some Q&A toward the end. But I do think for this conversation, like I mentioned, this is a continued conversation in the narrative of preparing for the Adaptation Forum, but also looking at it from more of a community perspective and how some of the local work and local to national work that's happening around communities and working on equity issues can be really essential in helping support ideas and conversations at NAV. So without further ado, I'm going to let Angela begin. Angela?
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Niall. I'm thrilled to be presenting to the National Adaptation Forum in preparation for your national meeting. CJ, we've taken on building the bigger we, the better we as a fundamental pillar of this movement moment. And we see the relationships we need to build to include labor, philanthropy, academia, national groups, and enviros, in addition to the public and private sector. And so thanks, Niall, Lauren, Wendy, Alex, and others for inviting us to be part of this webinar, because we hope that it really does spark ways for us to continue to work together with frontline and base building grassroots groups. So for those that may not know, the Climate Justice Alliance is a collaborative of over 50 base building community groups, movement support organizations, and alliances uniting frontline communities through an Our Power campaign. We're working together to forge a scalable and socioeconomical just transition away from unsustainable energy towards local living economies or regenerative economies. And these all address the root causes of climate change. So we're implementing stronger Our Power strategies, utilizing in this moment regional hubs, a distributed leadership model, and a reinvestment strategy in community energy and economy solutions that adapt to the needs of those most affected by climate, and utilizing their solutions to transform society. Next slide, please. So the moment is now to address the growing racial and economic divide in which we've lived in dysfunction, which has fundamentally been born from this historical extractive and fossil fuel economy. Much of the recent analysis around the federal political context, the fact that Trump's administration is in power now due to a right-wing populist movement, and the false economic promises that were the foundation of this transition at a federal level, is all structured around trying to evaluate how we can actually respond to this, and figuring out actually that there's so many threats that we're feeling disjointed and actually not feeling adequate in being able to respond to them at a federal level. So CJ has been building visionary opposition to the Trump administration, working with a number of our movement allies to build the people power to confront the dysfunction, the longstanding inequity, and the climate injustice, pivoting more so to the municipal, local, and regional focus. And we'll be talking more about that in a little bit. I've been in a number of strategy and assessment meetings, and it seems that overall we're looking at kind of four major kind of resistance strategies in this moment. One is like pushing the Dems to push the Republicans and to come out strongly in opposition to the Trump administration. The other one is resisting and moving forward an impeachment strategy. The third one is looking more like resisting the policies and the appointees themselves and creating kind of a movement around that. And the one that we're more closely aligning with, although we do participate in some of the others, is this movement of protecting our communities and moving our vision forward. And we feel that that one is also more in line with the adaptation partners. So just as we're focusing on Trump and the administration, CJ also finds that this moment is very symbolic of the kind of shift that Standing Rock has put forward. Standing Rock definitely inspired us to see what resistance might look like and how a local community might come together in one place to serve as the base of resistance for many fights. It weaved the narrative of resistance with adaptation in ways that expanded our own silos and fragmented approaches to solving deep-seated problems. And it uplifted the rights of indigenous sovereignty in ways that hold us accountable as a nation to our treaties with indigenous nations and understanding better the Constitution. I think these are all lessons we're learning to adapt and maximize with the Trump administration in office. Narratives like water is life, we are protectors, not protesters, we are all connected by the rivers and the waters that unite us were fundamental in shifting the way we talk about climate to learn from. Today, Trump put forth an executive order to revise the Water of the U.S. rule. Years ago, Scott Pruitt sued to have that rule overturned while Attorney General of Oklahoma. And so we see that there are a number of minimal safety guards that are being threatened, and we know that there's more to come. Earlier this month, the Trump administration fast-tracked approval to build the final section of DAPL pipeline and canceled the environmental impact statement ordered by President Obama. So construction is really near to completion, and oil could be flowing through that pipeline as early as March 6th. But the Sioux Tribe, IEN, and others that we have been working and supporting at Standing Rock are not yet giving up the fight. They're still appealing in court. They're asking us to organize at a city and state level and to work collectively to dry up the streams of funding to DAPL. So to date, the defund DAPL movement has divested nearly $70 million from institutions supporting the pipeline. We can foresee a number of dirty energy projects to include pipelines popping up across the country because of the administration's stance on fossil fuel expansion. But because of Standing Rock, the 200 tribes that joined them, the thousands that fought with them, and the millions that have been divested, we can also foresee that there's a strong and coordinated resistance that will be sprouting in those places as well. So we're taking the lead from places like Standing Rock, Bellingham, Pennsylvania, Seattle, and other areas, including rural areas, to see how to grow this resistance collectively. Next slide, please. CJ has been working with a number of partners to have a resilience and resistance strategy that includes distributed organizing and leadership, primarily to have a rapid response model that has been to actually respond to what our members are asking for now in terms of this intersectional approach that links climate to immigration, to gender, to militarization. We're working closely with them to develop structures for adaptability so that they can use the trainings and the responses that they're using on multiple levels. And in the long term, over 100 days and after then, include a multiplier effect for that work. Next slide, please. Some of the kind of analysis that we're looking at, as we mentioned, now that we're focusing on kind of municipal, local, and regional power building, is finding out where states have come out and oppose the Clean Power Plan and finding out where municipal mayors have come out in support of clean energy, and doing incremental analysis at this level to see where the entry points are for our groups to acquire power and share more around community responses and solutions to clean energy. Next slide, please. An example of this work is the strategies that we're building, expanding the Clean Power Plan and the state implementation plan works that we've done to a larger energy democracy platform. So, in this moment, we're not really clear what's going to happen with the CPP. We continue to support a power plan that's based in the people that are most affected. And we did put out an Our Power Plan campaign last year that we want to expand and continue working on. The CPP, although not sufficient, did serve as an excellent organizing tool for us to use to unite communities around exploration of what clean, pure power might look like and the community investment and control of that power. So some EJ frontline communities that have been working in that area include like our groups in New York, Washington, Oregon, California, but also groups in red states like Louisiana, Mississippi, New Mexico, Texas, and Kentucky. We're also assuring that whatever work we do, that there's a clear and distinct track of work for indigenous land and communities. So Black Mesa Water Coalition has been holding that track down. Next slide, please. The energy democracy work that we do is framed within a just transition framework. Our framework includes a number of sectoral shifts for adaptation, and there's a list of groups that are kind of leading that work. So happy to have CBE on the call as also one of our members. The sectoral shifts include things like energy democracy, which definitely talks about the control of energy by communities, food sovereignty, zero waste, house and land, and other different sectoral shifts that then create more of an intersectional response to climate and the number of threats that our groups are facing. Next slide, please. So some of the pivots that we've been doing to be able to respond to this moment, but also have visionary opposition for the long term, include having more of a cross-sector, translocal, and rapid response methodology to working with our members and being responsive to what they need. And we've done this through participating in It Takes Roots, which is a for Alliance collective. We are working closer with labor, so identifying pilots where the Blue-Green Alliance labor members can work with EJ communities to develop a more holistic just transition vision for the infrastructure plan. We're broadening CPP to energy democracy, as we showed, and then we're accelerating and intersecting just transition with a reinvest strategy. Understanding that right now, more than anything, our groups do need some visionary opposition and something to look forward to and plan around. So the Reinvest in Our Power, we're hoping to have 5 to 10 revolving loans in the next 4 years, starting with the first one this year, which would be an incubator. And through Just Transition, we're hoping to land 50 new campaigns this year around Just Transition that would actually have this intersectional, multi-sectoral approach to climate justice. Next slide, please. So we're sure that communities, through our surveys, through our conversations with our members, we know that communities are ready to lead an intersectional movement. This is a picture of the inauguration where we had the indigenous communities march at the front lines with Climate Justice Alliance and It Takes Roots communities. Next slide, please. So I wanted to kind of end, because we have limited time and open for more questions, to talk about the It Takes Roots to Grow the Resistance. It Takes Roots to Grow the Resistance has a historical framework around building with a number of alliances. We were intentional in this moment to be responsive in a way that did create this visionary opposition and that responded to what our groups wanted, which was we want to create solutions that are relevant to our communities. So we united with 4 alliances, represent 150 organizations in 30 states. A number of the alliances are women-led. We share staffing and coordination, but we haven't merged, and we still have kind of autonomy, and our missions are intact. And this is allowing us to broaden the grassroots movement while still deepening it, and then moving from working with a united front to then influence a more popular front. Some of the different issue areas that we're building along is to create shared tools, a rapid response method, some cross-sectoral movement building and training, uniting under a common frame that is intersectional, and then finally holding some translocal actions and some national actions where groups can really build on the ground in the moment and then take that work back home. So I'm going to end with that because I hope that there's more questions about it, but I want to thank you all for the time. Thanks, Niall.
Yes, thank you so much, Angela. Thank you so much. So we're going to, just in terms of time, we're going to keep moving, and definitely if you have questions, we're going to resurface those, and if you have comments, we're going to circle back. But Angela's contact information is there. Our next presenter is going to be Sandra Pope. She is the co-founder and lead facilitator for Advancing Equity and Opportunity Collaborative, and a co-founder and CEO at Rooted Consulting Group in Atlanta, Georgia. Sandra?
Hey, Niall, thank you, and hello to everyone on the phone. Again, my name is Chandra Pope, and I am the CEO of Rooted Consulting Group, and we are based in Atlanta, Georgia, and our primary goal is to develop and design game-changing roadmaps for achieving meaningful stakeholder engagement. I've been in the energy and climate policy work as an advocate for over 10 years, but deep down, I am just a plain organizer who possesses an equal amount of passion and dedication for engagement methods that are deeply rooted in industry knowledge, consensus building, and data-driven big picture thinking. Next slide. So when Niall invited me to be on the panel, I jumped at the opportunity because most often I am approached by practitioners and professionals in the climate and energy policy sector who have an urgency around increasing their reach in order to increase their impact, and specifically with groups and leaders who are advancing equity and justice. And lots of times I hear how many people don't feel equipped with the practical tools or approaches to developing meaningful relationships with their target audiences in order to achieve authentic engagement that ultimately leads to broader coalitions and deeper relationships. So during my presentation, I hope to leave you with some insight about some of these strategies and methods that organizations in the South have or are beginning to utilize in order to broaden their reach and increase their impact through collaboration and with a lens of equity. But before I jump into the case studies, I wanted to take you on a journey to the South in order to paint a picture of the impacts of climate change in the region and hopefully inspire some thinking around what's possible. Next slide. So I thought I'd open up by showing you a map of the United States and ask you to just focus in on the blue area for a moment. And what you'll notice may not come to you as a surprise given the history of the U.S., but the highest concentration of African Americans are located in the Southeast. Historically, the Southeast has been home to a majority of the nation's African Americans, making up 56% of the total U.S. African American population. The African American population in the Southeast continues to increase largely due to more blacks moving in states like Georgia, North Carolina, and Tennessee than are moving away to other parts of the country. Job opportunities, family ties, and other situations are all factors in this case. And meanwhile, the Latino population is growing faster in most of the South than in any other parts of the country. The census projects that by 2020, the number of persons of color will rise to an estimated 135 million and comprise 37.5% of the nation's citizens. So population growth in the coming decades is expected to be among people of color. Next slide. Next slide, please. Thanks. Meanwhile, the South is also home to 4 of the top 5 largest climate polluters in the U.S. power sector. And among them, the top 3 produce the largest amount of the pollution in the U.S. power sector. And we know that communities that are already at an economic disadvantage are also more likely to bear the brunt of the impacts of coal pollution, as many are located in the shadows of polluting coal facilities where air and water quality typically suffers. Next slide. So another piece of our story in the Southeast is the share of median household income consumed by electricity bills. Did you know the top 10 states in the continental U.S. with the highest share of household income consumed by electricity costs are all in the South? Mississippi, Alabama, and South Carolina are the top 3 in the continental U.S. This is due largely to the high amounts of energy inefficient homes, where low-income homeowners and senior citizens often live in leaky older homes that tend to let heat or cooled air escape, making them more vulnerable to rising energy costs. Next slide. In addition to experiencing chronic economic distress and health impacts associated with coal power pollution, people in the South face acute trauma in the wake of life-threatening weather. States in the South are struck more often than in any part of the country by more weather-related disasters that inflict more than $1 billion in damages. Next slide. And communities that suffer the worst storms along the Gulf Coast and the eastern seaboard face decades of recovery from the largest losses. Next slide. So I was telling this thread and this story to paint a picture of why there is a strategic significance and urgency to develop and sustain Southern leadership in the southeastern part of our country. So for the sake of time, I'm going to highlight 3 case studies of activity, initiative, and movements that are being facilitated in the South: the Advancing Equity and Opportunity Collaborative, the Just Energy Circle, and the Southeast Energy Efficiency Alliance's ARC engagement process. I chose these 3 as examples so that I could offer 3 different ways groups are collaborating at the regional, local, and state levels. And as I move forward in the presentation, I hope that you'll find some opportunities to connect your own work with some of these initiatives, campaigns, and movements. Next slide. So the first collaborative or example case study is the Advancing Equity and Opportunity Collaborative. It is an emerging Southern formation made up of communities fighting for dignity and fairness across the South, and who are all on the front lines of struggles for energy, climate, and environmental justice every day. As a central focus of work, AEO is working collaboratively across 3 areas of activity. 1, resistance and recovery from extreme extraction and weather disasters. 2, energy planning and decision-making, which was formerly focused on equity being centralized as part of any policy outcomes for the Clean Power Plan. And then 3, democratizing rural electric cooperatives for the more than 10 million people in the South who buy power from electric cooperatives in which customers have an ownership stake and a right to vote for board leaders, most of whom have invested very little in clean energy thus far. The formation consists of organizers spanning the Gulf Coast, Deep South, Southern Appalachia, and Coastal Carolinas areas of the South, who are all working to elevate the visibility of leading work in the South and exploring opportunities to increase support for communication and coordination to connect locally based work with a larger context in the region, as well as the national and international levels. AEO is a prime example of strengthening existing organizations and networks as a best practice for building a strong platform for sustained engagement among groups that recognize the strategic significance of their own voices in the field. Groups that hold equity as a central focus and purpose can serve as anchors for process that supports the participation of an even larger number of groups that recognize the importance of integrating equity more deeply into their work on climate change, clean energy, and environmental conservation. Next slide. I also wanted to highlight the Just Energy Circle, which is a local coalition located in Atlanta, Georgia, and is convened by the Partnership for Southern Equity. Its focus is to inspire diverse, authentic leadership that is recognized in prominent decision-making positions in both civic and private sectors like the Public Service Commission and local utility and energy service provider companies. This coalition has achieved unprecedented levels of involvement at the local level. During the 2013 Integrated Resource Planning hearing in Atlanta, the JEC was collectively able to fill the room with energy consumers to advocate on their own behalf for increased investments in energy efficiency and renewables. It was the first time in history of the IRP that this level of participation was experienced. It's also important to point out that PSE is in no way a quote-unquote traditional energy and climate policy advocacy organization. They are a local organization that has a history and reputation for working in the community on equity. But after a real commitment from some local partners and funders, PSE has really developed their muscle to meaningfully engage in energy policy advocacy within their own organizational frameworks and elevate their own leadership and voice on these issues. Next slide. Finally, I wanted to highlight the Southeast Energy Efficiency Alliance. They are a regional advocacy organization that is engaging in the ARC engagement process to develop a policy paper to help clarify existing terms, actors, and activities addressing equity in energy planning and decision-making in Georgia. The ARC engagement process is a four-phased approach that's anchored in cultural awareness and values, and it identifies what it takes to activate stakeholders and key audiences through the analysis of perspectives and field of experience. It was important for me to highlight what SIA is doing is another way groups in the Southeast are authentically building partnerships with key stakeholders and target audiences in order to increase their impact, as well as offer another approach for engaging people at the very granular level, like the everyday person and energy consumer. Next slide. And so there is a lot of work that is taking place in the Southeast, yet there are still a number of challenges that are being experienced. So I'd like to close by highlighting just a few of the challenges that have been raised to me in environments that I engage in as a thought-provoking exercise for folks on the phone. So I'd like to ask you to take a minute and think about how these experiences that I'm about to share and some of these challenges might come up for you in your own work around adaptation planning or climate advocacy, and what solutions to these challenges the National Adaptation Forum might facilitate as training, modules, and discussions during the conference in May. So the first challenge that often comes up, and I'm sure we all hear it, is more resources are needed for this work. And while this is true of most campaigns, movements, or initiatives, it is particularly important in this instance in the Southeast to drive resources towards building the case for support. And what I mean by this is tough work, and there's frequently no money, and tackling the issues are seen as too painful and too risky, especially because there aren't a lot of people under the tent working on equity and opportunity. So capacity is very thin. Not to mention, there are a lot of issues that make strategic alignment difficult. So resources and opportunities dedicated to elevating a narrative around the why is vital. You can hit the arrow, thank you. So the next challenge is, how do we get the folks who will be affected by energy, climate, and environmental justice to care? I know this makes a lot of us squirm in our seats, but for some of our friends and allies in this space, this is community engagement conundrum 101. So often these issues are affecting marginalized communities and trust is low, especially with organizations and groups that are traditionally white and male-led. The thought is, why invest in something if I'm not going to benefit or if nothing is going to change anyway? We really need to work collectively to build buy-in, to invest in the long-term game and not just a set of short-term initiatives or deliverables. Next. Number 3, we need more research to shine a light with data on what's happening. So there's a need for increased information that is shared in ways that people can actually digest it. We need to continue to work to build the capacity of local leaders who can also lead efforts after the campaigners and organizers and consultants are gone. Legacy training is vital. Creating blueprints and strategies for continuing the work are paramount. Many engagement initiatives are built on urgency and passion, but there's also a need to create a system by which the work can be built upon. At Rooted, we like to provide a mentoring component to our stakeholder engagement. This leaves room for education on and documentation of the best practices for community engagement. Next slide. So next is, social advocates are not always intimately familiar about the systems that they are challenging. And again, this one is cause to pause, but we really do need to conduct quality research to encourage more critical thinking for connecting the dots. So for example, providing training and leadership development opportunities on systemic analyses to help create a greater understanding of some of these more sophisticated systems, like how electric utility systems fit into community, and empowering advocates and practitioners to ask the right questions, like, what does it mean for the community to own their utility? Where are the jobs? Where are the programs? What does the entire system look like? If you pull this thread, then what happens? Next. And then finally, more work needs to be done on cultivating personal relationships, growing from a personal focus to one that is focused on community and global impact. We can't say it enough at Rooted. Relationships, relationships, relationships. Relationships are essential to building inclusive and impactful movements, campaigns, initiatives, or achieving any effective partnerships. And sometimes communication is a challenge because we all speak different languages. So finding common ground can be difficult, which can create anxiety around reaching out to different groups. But surface level relationships create surface level impact. Our ability to cultivate authentic relationships across many groups will be the ultimate solution for success. I am deeply gracious for the opportunity to offer you a trip to what we like to call the Dirty South, affectionately. As I stated in my opening, I do hope that you're inspired by what's possible. If we're effective in building a culture of collaboration, we can broaden our collective reach and our collective impact. I hope that I've afforded you an opportunity to connect your work and enhance the resilience of the communities in the South who are in the face of a changing climate every day. And I look forward to joining you in more dialogue and conversations about the strategic significance of leadership in the U.S. South on advancing equity and opportunity through work on energy, climate, and environmental justice at the local, state, regional, national, and international levels. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Deandra. I really appreciate your presentation, and your leadership has been great checking in with you about this work moving forward. Our last presenter, and then we're going to go to Q&A, so definitely if you have questions, please add them to the chat box, the question box. Our last presenter is Ernesto Arevalo, who is a Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Enhancement Coordinator at Communities for a Better Environment in California. So, Ernesto.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this webinar. I'm very excited to show off what we've been able to accomplish through our CARE project. So, as Niall mentioned, we are a statewide environmental justice nonprofit in California, and we operate in the communities of East Oakland, Richmond, Southeast LA, and Wilmington, which is a neighborhood of the city of LA. We began this, the CARE project, the Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Enhancement Project, in the tail end of 2013. And this project was really a response to the creation of climate action plans. And from experience, what we know is that the creation of these plans do not have the significant community engagement that is needed to really identify the real needs of our communities. So we started with creating this model where we started with, what does our community know? What do we know around existing vulnerabilities and assets in both of our communities? So the communities we're working in are Richmond and Wilmington, California. We then worked with our members to provide trainings and skill building workshops. So that way our members would be able to navigate the planning process, to fight for investment, to work towards ensuring that there'd be inclusions in climate action plans or general plans that include provisions that would provide benefits that are greatly needed. We work to create a tool with our residents. This is the Roadmap to Resilience that outlines 4 key areas of sea level rise, extreme heat events, healthcare services, and renewable energy. And then we're working on expanding our communications capacity, because many of these impacts of climate change, especially extreme heat, can be very immediate. And we need to let our community members know that it is an extreme heat day. They need to be able to access a cooling center. And then on the flip side, we have industrial disasters, which can happen at any moment's notice. And when our organizers are not available to let our members know, we need to make sure that we have that internal communications capacity so that our community members be aware of this type of health impact. And the worst case would be an extreme heat event accompanied by an issue like flaring, because that will intensify that impact of flaring in the community. So next slide, please. So what is one of the issues that we met is, was adaptation on the mind? And really, no, it wasn't. People did not know what climate adaptation was. We had to meet people where they were. We asked, what is adaptation? What is resiliency? And after having a conversation, we were able to find clues as to how to introduce these concepts and make them available in a way that would resonate. So people also didn't understand how climate change will impact their daily lives, how they could integrate adaptation into those impacts that they already see, because they see more urgent issues. So I mentioned we focused this project into communities, Richmond and Wilmington. Richmond, it has a refinery, Chevron, which famously exploded in 2012 and had a large impact on the community. Many went to the local doctor's medical clinic, which is no longer open. So now if there is another emergency like that, there's a gap in emergency health services available. We also have a port in Richmond. Coal trains are running through Richmond. There's freeway and diesel trains as well, and transportation of crude. In Wilmington is a neighborhood in the city of LA that is right next to Long Beach. It has the Port of LA and Port of Long Beach, as well as 5 surrounding refineries. There's neighborhood drilling, rails, the 710 freeway, which several diesel trucks travel by. So these are the impacts that many of our residents see on top of the existing injustices and disinvestment in the community. And what we can say is climate change intensifies existing injustices. For example, if you live in a residential community that's next to a lot of industrial land use, there's going to be a lot of asphalt and impermeable surfaces. And when days get hotter, you're going to experience that urban heat island effect. And part of that stems from the way that planning designates land uses as well as investment. So that is just one example of how we see disinvestment and injustice as a way that intensifies potential climate change impacts. So how did we work to address this? Through the CARE project, we held climate adaptation workshops that helped to break down these different concepts, as well as building CARE advisory boards to talk about these 4 key areas of extreme heat, sea level rise, healthcare services, and renewable energy. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So thank you. Can you go back? So understanding impacts and assessing vulnerability. So first, we did research. We found out what tools are available for us to understand the existing vulnerabilities in both Richmond and Wilmington. And local county public health departments have done that initial work. We also used that base to provide community education on vulnerability. But what these current tools are missing are the fine-tuned details of how a person lives their life and goes through their day and the choices they make to adapt to, for example, a hot day. So we had to ask directly how people think they would be able to acclimatize themselves or adapt to 100-degree weather, especially during a prolonged time. And we threw in the examples of things that already have happened in their community. So walking through personal experiences and how climate change can make those moments worse is one of the tactics that we use to help ground the need for acknowledging that climate change is going to impact us, to impact our community members. So this really highlights how communities like Wilmington and Richmond are on the front line of climate change, experiencing these injustices. This picture is of a workshop we held with Southeast LA and Wilmington youth. In this exercise, we highlighted an extreme heat days that expanded over 3 days. We threw in examples of things that have happened in the past, like a traffic pileup on the 710 freeway, flaring. Now, we also put into context that these issues of greater smog due to the traffic jam would worsen air quality. Same with flaring. And our youth had to make decisions based on, do they have access to a car? Is there a cooling center nearby? Do they have people that would be vulnerable in their family to an extreme heat event? Do any of their brothers or sisters have asthma or have experienced issues where they get nosebleeds on extreme heat days? And what is an extreme heat day? Because we're looking at Richmond and Wilmington, which are both coastal communities, which are not necessarily acclimatized to hotter weather, like 100 degrees and above. A hot day to someone living on the coast like Wilmington is going to be the higher 90s. And even then, they're going to experience those impacts of the beginnings of either extreme heat exhaustion, heat exhaustion, or heat stroke. And we've seen that through the beginnings of getting a nosebleed on hot days, especially for family members with chronic health impacts. So next slide. So solutions. So one of the things that we got from our members is having access to centers for relief. We reached out to the Sushi Clinic in Wilmington. This is a private site that has agreed to open its doors to the community and has also joined us in our advisory board to help create our roadmap to resilience, but also provide itself as an asset to the community in responding to these impacts from climate change. We have climate action plans that we are keeping an eye on and building up our membership to be able to secure those benefits that we need in the community. We have the roadmap to resilience, which we've created through our CARE project with advisory meetings that have helped to guide our members through these key areas that I've addressed. And whether or not the way that the information is presented is accessible enough. In these meetings, for example, with the picture listed, we listed out all of the chunk of the information and had them provide feedback on whether or not it was helpful or if they had any other questions as to how they could personally react to these impacts, whether it be an extreme heat event or sea level rise. Next slide, please. And so this is our roadmap to resilience. It's a tiny URL if you want to copy that down, and the QR code. Next slide, please. What comes next for us? We're going to continue to build up our leadership, and we're going to use the roadmap to resilience that we've created with our members to help provide a base around adaptation planning and what type of support is needed from community members to advocate for investment, because we need for there to be investment in our communities in order to have this type of adaptation planning enacted. We've already seen that there's been years of disinvestment in these communities. So one thing is starting to address that part of the injustice, because climate change, as I said, is going to intensify existing injustices. Existing injustices in investing in trees, existing injustices in cutting down pollution locally. So we need community-based planning. And we're also using our lessons learned locally and talking to residents in Richmond and Wilmington. And as we broaden out to discussing with our members in East Oakland and Southeast LA, how to uplift these local concerns at the statewide level. And for example, we've participated in the Climate Justice Working Group for providing input on Safeguarding California, which is a template that the state of California uses to address climate change impacts. Next slide. So if you want to keep up with our CARE work, you can follow us on #EJ4All and at CBECal. This is an example of a sea level rise activity that we use to introduce one of the impacts of climate change. But really, the take-home message here is that as the frontline communities, climate change does intensify existing injustices. And if we do want to be equitable, we need to do this on several fronts. One is ensuring that there be investment. Another one is addressing the prolonged exposure to localized pollution, these cumulative impacts, shifting away from this extractive economy to one that is more regenerative, as was mentioned earlier by Angela. We need that shift in our communities because right now we are thinking of adaptation, but in the longer road, when we're looking at our prolonged exposure and the continuing contribution of greenhouse gas emissions in our global system, we need to, one, cut down on local exposure to these co-pollutants and other things that continue to impact community health, and two, cut down on the overall contribution of greenhouse gas emissions. So that way, the impacts of climate change aren't as severe on our community. And building towards that regenerative economy can help address those injustices that have been experienced over years. So thank you.
Thank you, Ernesto. Thank you, Angela, and also thank you, Sandra, for your comments and your presentations. Each of the presenters also gave information to follow up with them, and also you can follow up with both Alex and I about additional other questions when you may have. But for the last few minutes here, I definitely want to kind of circle back to if there's any questions that have come up from listening from the speakers, from those participants that are on the call. So, Alex, do you see, I'm trying to pull this up here, questions that may have arisen? I mean, I have a couple questions for the speakers, but I want to see if other participants.
Niall, there was one for all panel members. There's a couple here, and I can read them out to the group. This one is from John Bolduc. And he states, we need to target activism in congressional districts and Senate seats that can be flipped. The resistance resides more predominantly in blue areas. If we don't put pressure on red seats, we will have a hard time holding back the Trump agenda. What are the thoughts of the panelists on how to reach and communicate better in those effectively into those red areas? What are some tools that we can have?
You want to read the second question as well? Or is that both? We just get them both out, then people can respond.
Yeah, so what are the thoughts, the speaker's thoughts on how we can reach more effectively into the red areas? So how do we effectively change those areas? It's a hard one.
I know. Ideas, thoughts, comments, presenters?
Hi, this is Chandra. I actually have a thought about it. One, I think, particularly in Georgia, some of the groups that I was speaking about have been trying to think through how they're targeting congressional seats at the local level, the state level, and at the federal level, given that we have the largest Black caucus in the state of Georgia, but then a large amount of congressional Black caucus members in the Southeast. And so I think that it's just really important, again, on connecting with local leaders and local campaigns and initiatives in order to continue to increase awareness and education so that these groups can advocate on their own behalf. It feels like that there is not a lot of engagement with these particular groups in terms of equity and even justice so that they can advocate to their state decision makers and their federal decision makers about the importance of engaging in this dialogue.
Great, thanks. Other direct responses, comments?
Yeah, just to circle back, this is Angela. Part of the mapping of what we were doing, I showed you just where the mayors and the attorney generals were positioning themselves around the CPP and clean energy. We've developed some other mapping around where the Senate seats are opening, particularly looking where our members overlap with other alliance members in red states. Because we strongly believe that the kind of organizing that needs to happen is very much what Sandra said. It's like organizing from the bottom up in these states versus trying to bring legislators on from the top down. And so, consulting with a lot of our members, we've realized reflections something like, we've been living in a Trump era for decades, especially in the South. And so we're learning to build from those and also identifying where there is already groups that are positioning strong candidates that reflect our values. So one of them is definitely Jackson. Jackson's moving somebody into place right there, looking at Pennsylvania in different areas, linking folks from Kentucky with other groups that are in red states to build power that way. So.
Great.
I just add, Niall, real quick too, is that I also think it's important in the vein of the question and just given the political climate to point out that there are a lot of initiatives that are really beginning to grow around increasing political leadership among millennials of color. For instance, the Collective, which is focused on building Black political power. So I think that any opportunity to collaborate with these particular initiatives and campaigns in order to get in front of opportunities for educating again and bringing awareness. I mean, I think that one of the bigger challenges for this movement is that we are very siloed, Niall, like you said, and we oftentimes operate in our silo and in our bubble around the folks who are experiencing and thinking critically and technically about this work, and that we really have to figure out how are we actually touching the everyday person so that they can understand how vitally important this work is.
That's really important. I do think that the question also brings up, just like the whole point of this call, is that there's so many I guess various issues that a lot of people are talking about from the silo perspective, and also trying to figure out the role around climate-related work. Just thinking about like the adaptation field as this original call was set up for this kind of audience, how it's interconnected with everything else, and just how we need to be even more attentive to those issues and how we're personally doing the work, and also like the personal and professional piece, like how we personally show up in places in our community, in our state, our region, and then also professionally, what role can we actually play to make the connections that we're talking about on this call. And I think each presenter brought us some good examples of, like, from local to state to networks to regional efforts that are happening. I think, for everyone on the call that's participating, how do we do a better job of communicating about that, the personal and professional piece linked to our to making changes and also making a difference? I think the question that was raised posed us all to continue to think about creative ways we can do that, but also trying to figure out ways we can learn together. So I think, as we move forward and prepare for the National Adaptation Forum, I hope some of these points that was brought up on this call can continue to be a part of the ongoing conversation that we're thinking about what's going to happen at the federal level, what's going to happen to federal employees that work on climate issues, the climate policies, the data, all the data that's coming from the different, from NOAA and other areas that might be gutted or taken out. What is our response to ensure that data is maintained in terms of the climate work that's happening, to other issues that are happening? I know there's different people working on different areas. And so I just want to encourage, as we take the next step into these discussions, that we continue to have open dialogue and conversations and to try to bring up solutions, strategies, ideas that we can share amongst each other. So I just hope this conversation helps to encourage more of that ongoing dialogue as we move forward to the National Adaptation Forum. And with that said, we're really close. We're at time, and I wanted to just make sure, Alex, if you have any kind of last points or comments, or before we close the call.
Sure. Next slide really quick, Lauren, or not. I just wanted to let everybody know that the webinar recording will be available at cakex.org, and so folks can look it up there. And also we have the call for posters was extended until midnight tonight. So if anybody still wants to present at the forum, you still have an opportunity to do that. Just check out our website at nationaladaptationforum.org. And that's it. Thank you so much, Niall, and for organizing this, and our panel members. It was a great discussion. There are a few more questions, but I will send those out to the panelists so that they can answer those via email to participants. So thank you, everybody.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day, and we look forward to continue working together